Have you ever wondered where the noise of a civilization goes when it stops? We assume that history is a solid line, a continuous road from the past to the present, paved with dates and battles and names carved into granite. But perhaps history is more like a radio signal, fading in and out of the static, prone to interference, prone to long unexplained silences. We're about to walk into one of those silences, into the golden twilight of the Neo-Babylonian Empire. It is a story of immense grandeur, of towers that tried to scratch the floor of heaven, and of a sudden, mysterious erasure. So before you get too comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really like what I'm doing here. It helps the signal reach a little further into the dark, and tell me, down in the comments, where you're listening from tonight, and what is the hour on your clock. Let's synchronize our time before we lose track of it altogether. To understand the rise of the Neo-Babylonian Empire, we must first stand in the ashes of the world that preceded it. Before Babylon rose again, there was the shadow of Assyria. For centuries, the Assyrian war machine was the definition of inevitability. It was a mechanism of iron and terror that spanned the known world, a force so absolute that its end seemed impossible to conceive. And yet, the end came. Not with a whimper, but with a violence that shook the foundations of the Near East. The year was 612 BC. The place was Nineveh. We are told by the scribes that a coalition of Medes and Babylonians, peoples who had long been under the Assyrian heel, finally broke the back of the beast. But there is something strange about the speed of the collapse. How does an empire that has perfected the art of warfare for 300 years disintegrate in the span of a single generation? It is a question that haunts the archaeological record. The layers of ash found at Nineveh are thick, speaking of a fire so intense it turned mud brick into glaze. It suggests not just a conquest, but a purge, a desire to wipe the slate clean. Out of this smoke stepped Nabopolassar. He is a figure shrouded in the fog of transition. He calls himself a son of a nobody, a phrase that echoes through the inscriptions. Was he truly a commoner who rose by merit, or does nobody imply a lineage that had to be hidden, a connection to a past that Assyria had tried to erase? He appears first as a governor, a servant of the dying empire. But when the moment of weakness arrived, he became the architect of its execution. He declared himself King of Babylon, resurrecting a title that had been dormant, suppressed, sleeping in the clay. But this was not merely a political revolution. It feels, when you read the prayers and the dedications, like a spiritual restoration. The Babylonians did not see themselves as creating something new. They believed they were putting the world back into its correct alignment. They were the restorers of the Sumerian order, looking back to a golden age that existed thousands of years before them. It is a recurring theme in human history, the idea that the truth lies in the past, buried under our feet, waiting to be exhaled. Nabopolassar spent his reign clearing the debris. Imagine the scene. The great cities of the north are burning. The Tigris River is choked with the bodies of the fallen empire, and in the south, in the marshlands and the ancient urban centres, the Babylonians are beginning to stack brick upon brick. They are fighting a war, yes, but they are also fighting against entropy. They are trying to re-establish the axis mundi, the centre of the world. There is a curious detail in the chronicles regarding the Scythians, those horse lords of the north who swept down like a natural disaster. They were agents of chaos, utterly unpredictable. Some historians suggest that the fall of Assyria was not just a political event, but a climate event, a migration event, a systemic collapse triggered by drought or famine that forced these northern tribes to move, smashing everything in their path. Babylon rose not because it was the strongest, but because it was the shelter in the storm. It was the vessel that promised to carry civilization through the flood of barbarism. When Nabopolassar died, he left the throne to his son, Nebuchadnezzar. And here the story shifts from survival to transcendence. If the father was the warrior who cleared the land, the son was the dreamer who sought to fill the void with geometry. Nebuchadnezzar is a name that vibrates with power. Even now, we know him from the Bible as a conqueror, a destroyer of temples, a villain. But in the inscriptions of Babylon, he is the provider, the one who feeds the gods. His reign begins with a frenzy of construction that is almost manic in its intensity. Why build so much? Why build so high? It is as if he was afraid of the silence returning. He surrounded Babylon with walls so thick that a 4-horse chariot could turn around on top of them. This is not just defense. This is a statement of permanence. He was carving a circle of safety in a chaotic universe. Consider the materials. Millions upon millions of baked bricks. Unlike the stone of Egypt, which was cut from the earth, the brick of Babylon was manufactured. It was mud, water, and fire. It was an alchemical process of turning the soft, yielding riverbed into something eternal. Each brick was stamped with the king's name and a prayer. I am Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, the one who provides for Esagila and Ezida. Imagine the workforce required for this. Not just slaves, as the old stories tell us, but skilled labourers, thousands of them, moving in a synchronized rhythm, baking the earth to build a mountain. But what were they hiding? In the deep foundations of these new temples, archaeologists have found deposits, statues and tablets from eras long before Nebuchadnezzar, carefully placed almost like seeds. The Neo-Babylonians were obsessed with the archaic. They dug up the statues of ancient kings and reburied them with honour. It suggests a civilization that was deeply insecure about its own legitimacy, or perhaps deeply aware of the cycles of time. They knew that what rises must fall, and so they tried to anchor themselves to the bedrock of the deep past. The city became a machine for processing the divine. The streets were laid out in a grid, a reflection of the order they saw in the stars. The processional way was paved with limestone and breccia, flanked by walls of blue-glazed brick adorned with lions and dragons. The Mushkushu, the dragon of Marduk, a creature with the head of a snake, the body of a leopard, the talons of an eagle. Why these specific animals? They are guardians, yes, but they are also symbols of the chaotic forces that Marduk, the patron god, had tamed. The city was a testament to order imposed upon chaos. Yet there is a shadow here. The records speak of the Bit Akitu, the New Year's festival house, where the king had to be humbled. Once a year, the king was stripped of his regalia, slapped by the high priest until he cried tears. If he did not weep, it was a bad omen. The god required the humiliation of the most powerful man on earth to ensure the sun would rise for another year. It is a stark reminder that in Babylon power was never absolute. It was borrowed. It was fragile. We look back at them and see a golden age. But did they feel it? Or did they feel the anxiety of the latecomer, the civilization that arrives at the end of the day, trying desperately to keep the sun from setting? They were surrounded by the ruins of Sumer and Akkad, ghosts of empires that had lasted longer than they ever would. They built higher and thicker because they knew the truth that the wind whispers to the stone. Everything eventually turns to dust, and in that frantic building, in that desire to make the clay speak, they created one of the most enduring mysteries of the ancient world. A garden that defied gravity. A mountain of green in a land of brown, or so we're told. But as we walk toward the Ishtar Gate, as we pass under the blue archway where the lions watch us with unblinking eyes, we have to ask, where is it? Where is the evidence? Or was the greatest achievement of this empire not a structure of brick, but a structure of the mind, a dream so potent that we are still dreaming it today? The gate is open. The lions are waiting. But the city inside is not what you expect. It is quiet. Too quiet. To enter the city is to leave the known world behind. You're not merely crossing a threshold of space. You're crossing a threshold of frequency. Imagine for a moment that you are a traveller from the dusty, chaotic plains of the Levant, or perhaps a merchant from the rugged highlands of Persia, walking toward the centre of the world in the 6th century BC. The landscape around you is brown, ochre, the colour of dried mud and scorched earth. The heat is a physical weight, a pressure on the back of the neck. And then, rising out of the heat haze like a hallucination, you see it. A mountain of blue, a cliff face of pure, shimmering lapis lazuli that defies the logic of the desert. This is the Ishtar Gate. It is not just a defensive structure, it is a psychological weapon. In a world of earth tones, Nebuchadnezzar built a sky that you could touch. We must pause to consider the sheer audacity of this colour. In the ancient world, blue was the colour of the divine, the colour of the deep ocean and the high heavens, places where humans could not go. To coat an entire city gate in this colour was to declare that Babylon had ceased to be a terrestrial city. It had become an extension of the celestial realm. The chemistry alone suggests a civilization operating at the peak of its technical powers. To create that glaze, that deep, resonant blue, required a precise mixture of copper, heat, and glass, fired at temperatures that would melt lesser materials. It was an industrial miracle, repeated thousands upon thousands of times, brick by brick, tile by tile. As you walk closer, the scale of the geometry begins to overwhelm you. The walls are not just high, they are absolute. They block out the horizon. They curate your reality. You're entering the processional way, a canyon of brick paved with red breccia and white limestone. Look at the walls. They're alive. This is not a metaphor. The Babylonians did not distinguish between the symbol and the thing itself in the way we do. To them, the image carried the potency of the essence, and here, marching alongside you in low relief, are the guardians, the lions of Ishtar, mouths open in a silent roar, their muscles tense, their tails twitching in a rhythm that matches your own heartbeat. There are 120 of them, a repetition that becomes hypnotic. But there are other things here, creatures that do not exist in our biology textbooks, the mushkushu, the dragon. Look at it closely. It is a chimera, a composite of the most dangerous things in the natural world. The head and neck of a serpent, the front legs of a lion, the hind legs of an eagle, and the stinging tail of a scorpion. Why this specific assembly of parts? It is a code. It represents the mastery over the three domains, the earth, the sky, and the underworld. By placing these dragons on the gate, Nebuchadnezzar was not just decorating. He was binding the chaotic forces of the universe into the masonry. He was saying that the chaos has been tamed, domesticated, and made to serve the order of Babylon. Consider the millions of bricks that make up this structure. Archaeologists have found something unsettling about them. On the edges of the bricks, on the faces that were mortared shut and hidden deep inside the thickness of the wall, surfaces that no human eye would ever see once the wall was built, there are inscriptions. I am Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, who provides for a Sagila and a Zida. Why write a message that is destined for darkness? Who is reading it? This reveals the true nature of the Neo-Babylonian project. It was not built for the approval of the people. It was a transmission directed at the gods and at the fabric of time itself. The king was planting his identity into the molecular structure of the city. He was ensuring that even if the city were destroyed, even if the walls were toppled, the dust itself would still scream his name. It creates a sense of vertigo, doesn't it? The idea that the architecture is conscious, that the walls are a library of silent prayers pressed together with bitumen and mud. It suggests that the city was not a habitat for humans, but a massive, intricate circuit board designed to channel divine energy from the heavens down into the Temple of Marduk. And what of the man who dreamed this geometry? Nebuchadnezzar. The scriptures paint him as a madman who ate grass like an ox. But perhaps madness is just the word we use for a mind that has expanded beyond the safe boundaries of human perception. To conceive of this city, to demand this level of perfection, requires a consciousness that is detached from the trivialities of daily life. He was obsessed with the square, the rectangle, the straight line. In a nature that is organic and curved, he imposed the grid. This is the geometry of dominion. As you pass through the inner gates, the noise of the outside world is cut off. The acoustics change. The air seems cooler, stiller. You're now inside the machine. To your right, the great ziggurat rises, a topic for another time. But its shadow is always there, moving like a sundial across the palaces. But it is the ground beneath your feet that should worry you. The excavations have shown that the Neo-Babylonian level is built on top of the destruction of the previous era, sealing it in. They were walking on the bones of their ancestors, quite literally. The construction of Babylon was an act of burying the past as much as it was building the future. It was a thick, heavy lid placed over the trauma of the Assyrian wars, and yet there is a fragility to it. All this grandeur is made of mud, glazed, baked, painted, but mud nonetheless. It is the earth trying to be stone. It is a civilization fighting against its own geology. If the water rises, if the river shifts, the bricks dissolve. The spell breaks. So, as we stand in the centre of this impossible blue canyon, surrounded by dragons that do not blink, we have to ask, what were they? Protecting? The walls are so thick, the gates so formidable. Usually you only build a cage this strong if you are afraid of what is outside, or perhaps you build a cage this strong because you are afraid of what is inside. What was at the heart of the grid? What was the kernel of truth that required 15 million bricks to keep it safe? We look for the centre, and we expect to find a throne room or a treasury. But the legends whisper of something else. They whisper of a mountain that was not a mountain, of a garden that hung in the air like a mirage, a place where the rules of gravity and biology were suspended. But when we look at the map, when we look at the archaeological trenches, the space is empty. The silence returns. The blue tiles fall away, and we're left staring at a blank spot in the record. A ghost in the geometry. We move now from the blue stone to the green leaf, stepping into the most seductive and slippery chapter of the Babylonian memory. We enter the realm of the impossible. In the catalogue of human wonders, there is one entry that refuses to sit still, one image that floats above the city like a heat mirage, shimmering, shifting, and perhaps not being there at all, the Hanging Gardens. Even the name suggests a suspension of the laws of nature. A garden does not hang. It roots. It grips the earth. To make a garden hang is to defy gravity, to tell the soil that it belongs in the sky. Close your eyes and try to reconstruct the image that has been painted by centuries of artists and dreamers. We're told of a man-made mountain rising from the flat, baking plains of Mesopotamia. A ziggurat not of brick, but of biology. Terraces stacked upon terraces, overflowing with cypress, cedar, ebony, and oak. Trees that were brought from the ends of the known world, their roots tangled in deep soil carried up by the backs of slaves, suspended on great stone vaults. The air here does not smell of dust and sun-baked clay. It smells of resin and wet moss, a pocket of humid jungle trapped in an arid cage. The story of its creation is one of the most romantic in the ancient world, and that alone should make us suspicious. Romance is often the veil we drape over the truth when the facts are too sharp or too dull. They say Nebuchadnezzar built it for his wife, a Metis of Media. She was a daughter of the mountains, married into the flatlands of the alluvial plain to seal a political alliance. She looked out at the endless horizon of Babylon, the relentless horizontal line of the desert, and she wept for the vertical world she had lost. She missed the peaks, the cascading streams, the rustle of the wind in the high pines. And so, the king, in an act of monumental devotion, decided to bend reality to comfort her. He built her a mountain. But as we walk through the archaeological site today, kicking through the shards of pottery and the dust of millennia, we encounter a problem, a silence. The spade of the excavator strikes the earth, but it hits no roots. Robert Koldewey, the German archaeologist who spent 18 years dissecting the corpse of Babylon, desperately wanted to find this wonder. He found the Ishtar Gate, he found the processional way, he found the palaces, and then, in a corner of the southern palace, he found a strange structure, a basement with thick walls and vaulted arches, and something even rarer, stone. Stone was precious in Babylon, almost everything was brick. He also found a 3-shafted well. He looked at this damp, dark cellar and declared, "This is it. This is the foundation of the gardens." The well was the pump. The arches held the weight of the trees. It was a leap of faith born of desire. He needed the legend to be true. But modern analysis suggests this room was likely just a warehouse, perhaps for olive oil or grain, the stone used, simply to keep it cool. The well was likely just a well. The wonder shrinks into a pantry. And here the silence deepens. Herodotus, the Greek historian who loved a good story and claimed to have visited Babylon, describes the walls, the river, the customs. He describes the size of the bricks. But of the hanging gardens, one of the 7 wonders of the world, he says nothing, not a word. How do you miss a mountain of green in the middle of a desert city? It is like visiting Giza and failing to mention the pyramids. His silence is a loud, ringing noise in the historical record. This leads us to a more unsettling hypothesis, a theory that suggests a theft of memory. What if the gardens were never in Babylon at all? What if the memory of them drifted down the river, displaced by time and confusion? There are scholars who point north, to the hated enemy, to the city of ash, Nineveh. The Assyrian king Sennacherib, the grandfather of the destruction we spoke of earlier, left inscriptions that detail a palace without rival. He boasts of cotton trees, of screw pumps cast in bronze, centuries before Archimedes, raising water to high terraces. He speaks of a garden that mimics the Amanese Mountains. Could it be that the Greeks, confused by the fall of one great Mesopotamian capital and the rise of another, conflated the two? Did the glamour of Babylon absorb the achievements of Nineveh? It is a cruel irony. Nebuchadnezzar, who sought to erase the Assyrian shadow, who built his city to eclipse the past, may have been credited with his enemy's greatest masterpiece. The world remembers the hanging gardens of Babylon, not the hanging gardens of Nineveh. It suggests that history is not about what happened, but about what sticks. Babylon had the better PR. Babylon had the Bible. Babylon had the mystique. And so it stole the garden. Or perhaps there is a third possibility, a more mystical one. The Persian word for a walled garden is paradisa. It is the word from which we get paradise. In the ancient mind, the garden was not just landscaping, it was a sacred enclosure, a microcosm of the original state of the world before the chaos of civilization. Maybe the hanging gardens were never a physical structure of brick and soil, but a theological ideal, a space that existed in the rituals and the incense smoke of the temples, a phantom garden that every king claimed to possess, because to possess the garden was to possess the mandate of heaven. We are left with the ghost of a scent, the smell of a cedar in a place where no cedar grows, the sound of rushing water in a dry land. Whether they were in Nineveh, in Babylon, or only in the mind of a lonely queen, they represent something profound. The human need to conquer the environment, to create a sanctuary against the harshness of the world. But nature always wins in the end. The pumps fail, the water stops, the trees die, the mud brick crumbles under the weight of the wet soil. If the gardens did exist, in Babylon they would have required an army of slaves just to keep the pumps turning, day and night, a ceaseless expenditure of energy to fight the entropy of the desert. When the empire fell, the first thing to go would have been the water, and within a month the paradise would have turned to brown, brittle tinder, a mountain of dead wood waiting for a spark. We leave the phantom greenery behind, dissolving back into the heat haze, but as we look up from the non-existent roots, our eyes are drawn to something else, something that does not hide, something that strikes the sky with a clenched fist. The gardens may be a myth, but the tower is real, and it casts a long shadow over the history of human ambition. The bricks here are not silent. They are speaking a language that was meant to be universal, a language that was broken. We are approaching the Etemenanki. The gardens may have been a ghost, a shimmering trick of the heat and the longing heart, but the tower was real. You could feel it in the soles of your feet. If you stood in the streets of Babylon 6 centuries before the Common Era, you would not just see the tower, you would sense its gravity. It was the heavy, silent centre around which the entire city, and perhaps the entire cosmos, seemed to revolve. We leave the phantom leaves behind and walk toward the geometric absolute. We approach the Etemenanki. The name itself is a heavy stone dropped into a deep well, Etemenanki, the house of the foundation of heaven and earth. It was not merely a building, it was an anchor. The Babylonians believed that the universe was a chaotic, floating thing, always at risk of drifting apart, of unspooling into the void. To keep the sky from flying away from the earth, you needed a pin. You needed a nail driven through the layers of reality to hold them together. The ziggurat was that nail. The Bible remembers it with fear and awe, calling it the Tower of Babel. In that story, it is a monument to human hubris, a fist shaken in the face of the Almighty. Come, let us build ourselves a city with a tower that reaches to the heavens, so that we may make a name for ourselves. But to the people of Babylon, it was an act of extreme piety. It was not built to storm the gates of heaven. It was built to offer a staircase for the God to come down. It was an invitation. It was a landing pad for the divine. Visualize the structure. It was not a smooth pyramid like those in Egypt, which were tombs sealed against the light. This was a mountain of geometry, a stepped altar rising nearly 300 feet into the air, a perfect square at the base, 90 meters by 90 meters, rising in 7 distinct stages. The number 7 was not accidental. It vibrated with the frequency of the 7 known planets, the 7 wanderers of the night sky. Each level was painted a different colour, a chromatic ascent from the dark earth to the brilliant sky. Black for the underworld, red for the earth, orange, yellow, and finally at the very summit, a shrine of pure indigo blue, glazed to match the night, rimmed with horns of gold that caught the first and last light of the sun. The construction of this beast required a mobilization of labour that boggles the modern mind. We are told of baked brick for stone and bitumen for mortar. Pause on that word. Bitumen. Asphalt. The black, viscous blood of the earth that bubbled up from the ground in Mesopotamia. It was the ancient world's super glue, a waterproof sealant that allowed them to build in the swamps. The tower smelled of it. It didn't smell like a cathedral. It smelled like a road crew, like industry, like burning tar. It was a machine made of mud and oil. But the true mystery of the Etemenanki lies not in its engineering, but in the shadow it cast over human consciousness. The story of Babel is the story of the confusion of tongues. We are told that before the tower, the whole world had one language and a common speech. What was this single language? Was it merely a spoken dialect, a proto-Semite tongue, or does the myth point to something deeper, something lost? Some esoteric traditions suggest that this one language was not a language of words, but a language of direct perception, a telepathic or mathematical clarity where the signifier and the signified were the same, a state of consciousness where there was no misunderstanding, no friction between mind and mind. The construction of the tower represents the apex of this unified humanity, a moment when the collective human will was so focused, so synchronized, that it threatened the boundaries between men and gods. And then, the rupture. The signal was jammed. Let us go down and confuse their language so they will not understand each other. The tower was left unfinished, or perhaps it was destroyed. The bricks stopped rising. The unity shattered into 1,000 fragments, 1,000 mutually unintelligible dialects. We live in the debris of that explosion. Every time we struggle to communicate, every time a message is lost in translation, we are feeling the aftershocks of the collapse of Babel. The historical tower, the one Nebuchadnezzar restored, was his attempt to put the pieces back together. He writes in his cylinders, "I made it the wonder of the people of the world. I raised its top to heaven, made doors for the gates, and covered it with bitumen and bricks." He was trying to repair the broken link. At the very top of the tower, in that blue shrine, there was no statue. There was only a large ornate couch and a golden table. It was an empty room, waiting. Waiting for what? Herodotus tells us that a single woman, chosen from all the women of Babylon, slept there alone at night. She was the vessel, the bride of Marduk. It creates a haunting image. One woman, isolated 300 feet above the sleeping city, listening to the wind howl through the blue tiles, waiting for a god to descend from the stars. It was the ultimate point of contact, the spark gap between the human and the non-human. But the spark eventually faded. The tower did not survive. When Alexander the Great arrived in Babylon centuries later, he found the Etemenanki in ruins, a victim of Persian destruction and the slow, grinding erosion of the rain. The great conqueror, standing before the melted mountain of mud, was struck by a desire to rebuild it. He ordered 10,000 men to clear the debris. They worked for months moving the rubble, trying to find the foundation. But Alexander died before the first new brick could be laid. The project was abandoned. The tower became a quarry. For 2,000 years, the people of the region took the bricks to build their houses, their stables, their walls. The foundation of heaven and earth was dismantled piece by piece and absorbed into the mundane architecture of the everyday. The sacred became the domestic. Today, if you go to the site, you will see something that looks like the inverse of a tower. You will see a square moat, a waterlogged depression in the ground, overgrown with reeds. The mountain has become a hole. the axis mundi has become a void. It is a wet, silent scar on the landscape. Yet the idea remains. We are still building it. We build it with servers and fibre optic cables, with satellites and translation algorithms. We're trying to recreate the one language, the global network, the unified mind. We're trying to reach the heavens again, not with bricks, but with data. And one has to wonder, as we stack our digital layers higher and higher, are we approaching the same threshold? Are we inviting the same confusion? The tower stands in the centre of the story as a warning. It tells us that there is a limit to how high we can climb before the air gets too thin, before the language breaks down, before the gravity of our own nature pulls us back to the mud. The Etemenanki is gone, but the desire to build it has never left us. We leave the wet depression in the ground, the ghost of the great ziggurat, and we turn our faces toward the river. The physical structures of Babylon are impressive, the walls, the gates, the tower, but the true tragedy of this empire is not architectural, it is human. It is the story of a people uprooted, dragged across the desert and forced to weep by the waters of a strange land. We must now look at the exile. We leave the shadow of the broken tower and walk down to the water's edge. The Euphrates is a wide, muscular river here, brown with the silt of the Anatolian mountains, indifferent to the cities it feeds. It is the artery of the empire carrying grain, bricks and armies. But if you listen closely to the sound of the water lapping against the reeds, you might hear a different frequency, a sound of mourning, a sound of displacement. We have explored the stone, the brick, and the tower, the hard shell of the empire. Now we must touch its soft tissue, its human cost. We must look at the people who are dragged here to marvel at the walls, only to find themselves staring at the bars of a golden cage. This is the era of the exile, the weeping by the water. It is perhaps the most famous image of the Neo-Babylonian period, etched into the collective consciousness not by the Babylonians themselves but by their victims. By the rivers of Babylon there we sat down, yea, we wept, when we remembered Zion. The words of the psalm float to us across 25 centuries, carrying the specific heavy ache of homesickness. But what does it mean to lose your world? Nebuchadnezzar was not a man who practiced genocide. He practiced something more sophisticated, more administrative. He practiced deconstruction. When he conquered a rebellious state like the Kingdom of Judah, he did not kill everyone. He decapitated the society. He skimmed off the cream, the princes, the priests, the silversmiths, the scholars, the generals, and he marched them across the desert to the centre of the world. He left the poor, the uneducated, the farmers behind to till the soil. It was a strategy of brain drain, enforced by the spear. He wanted to absorb the intellectual and technical vitality of the periphery to feed the engine of Babylon. Imagine the psychological rupture. For the people of the ancient world, a god was a locative entity. The god lived in the temple. The god lived on the mountain. If you left the land, you left the jurisdiction of the god. When the temple in Jerusalem was burned in 586 BC, when the ark was lost, when the city walls were breached, it should have been the end of the story. In the logic of the ancient Near East, the defeat of a people meant the defeat of their deity. Marduk had beaten Yahweh. The argument was settled by fire. The exiles should have assimilated, forgotten their names, and melted into the pot of Babylon, just like the northern tribes of Israel had vanished into the Assyrian mist a century before. But something strange happened in the mud-brick suburbs of Babylon, something that changed the history of human thought. The exiles refused to dissolve. Instead of accepting the silence of their god, they reinterpreted the silence. They looked at the catastrophe not as a defeat, but as a punishment. a parent disciplining a child, and in doing so, they did something revolutionary. They detached their god from the land. They decided that their god was portable. He could travel across the desert. He could be present even here, in the heart of the enemy's capital, amidst the ziggurats and the dragon gates. This required a new technology. If you cannot have a temple of stone, you must build a temple of words. It is generally believed by scholars that the exile was the crucible, where much of the Hebrew Bible was compiled, edited, and solidified. The scroll replaced the altar. The story became the sanctuary. In the absence of ritual sacrifice, they turned to the ritual of memory. They wrote furiously. They wrote to preserve their genealogy, their laws, their myths. They wrote to prove that they still existed. Babylon, with its millions of bricks and its obsession with physical permanence, inadvertently created its own destroyer. The empire focused on the hardware, the walls, the canals, the towers. The exiles focused on the software, the text, the code, the idea. And as history has shown us, the hardware eventually crumbles. The software endures. Archaeology gives us glimpses of their lives. We have found tablets, the Al-Yahudu tablets, archives of a community of Judean exiles living in Judah town in Babylonia. They show us people who are not just weeping. They were signing contracts. They were trading. They were renting land. They were naming their children with names that honoured their own god, even while serving the Babylonian king. They were navigating the tension between integration and resistance. They were learning the wisdom of the Chaldeans, absorbing the science, the astronomy, and the stories of the Babylonians, and weaving them into their own narrative. Think of the irony. We know the name Nebuchadnezzar largely because of the Bible. He wanted to be remembered for his piety to Marduk, for his great construction projects. Instead, he's remembered as the villain in someone else's story. He's the golden head in the dream of Daniel, the king who goes mad. His legacy was hijacked by the very people he tried to erase. The pen, in the long, slow war of history, proved mightier than the sword. The text outlived the tower. But there is a darker layer to this silence. The exile was not just about writing books. It was a trauma that fundamentally altered the psyche. It introduced a new tone to religion, the tone of the apocalyptic. When the world you know ends, when the temple burns, you begin to dream of a different kind of world. You begin to look for signs of a final judgment, a cosmic rectification. The exiles looked at the glory of Babylon, the sheer crushing weight of its wealth and power, and they said, "This cannot last. This is a lie." They developed the ability to see the ruins within the standing building. They saw the fall of Babylon before it happened, and this brings us to the nature of memory itself. Babylon was an empire of memory, obsessed with digging up the past to justify the present. The exiles were a people of memory, obsessed with preserving the past to ensure a future. Two civilizations locked in a strange embrace, one holding the other captive, while the captive secretly wrote the epitaph of the captor. As the sun sets over the Euphrates, the shadow of the willow trees lengthens across the water. The harps are hung on the branches, silent. But in the small lit rooms of the exile communities, the reeds are scratching against the clay, and the ink is drying on the parchment. They are encoding a virus into the system of history, a story of liberation that will eventually bring the empire down from the inside. But while the exiles were looking down at their scrolls, the Babylonian priests were looking up. High above the weeping and the writing, the sky was turning. The Babylonians were the masters of the night. They were watching the mechanism of the universe with an intensity that borders on madness. They saw things in the dark that we are only just beginning to rediscover. We must leave the river bank now and climb to the observatory. we must turn our eyes to the watchers of the night. The city below has fallen silent. The shouts of the merchants, the creak of the ox carts, the weeping of the exiles by the river, all of it has dissolved into the heavy, heat-radiated quiet of the Mesopotamian night. But on the high terraces of the temples, in the shadow of the great ziggurat, there are men who never sleep. They are the Tupshar Enuma Anu Enlil, the scribes of the Omen series. They are the watchers. We leave the emotional turmoil of the earth to enter the cold, mathematical precision of the sky. This is the realm of the Chaldeans, a name that would become synonymous with magician and sorcerer for centuries to come. But they were not casting spells in the way we imagine. Their magic was data. To understand the Neo-Babylonian mind, you must understand their relationship with the night. To us, the sky is a backdrop, a vast emptiness sprinkled with distant nuclear furnaces. To them, the sky was a script. It was a surface on which the gods wrote their intentions in a language of light and motion. Every shooting star, every lunar halo, every conjunction of planets was a sentence, a warning, a decree. As above, so below. This was not a metaphor, it was a law of physics. If the planet Mars turned red and retrograded in the constellation of the Scorpion, it meant war was coming to the west. If the moon was obscured by a cloud on the 15th day, the harvest would fail. The universe was a single, interconnected organism, and the sky was its nervous system. For over 6 centuries, a time span that puts our modern scientific records to shame, these scribes maintained what we now call the astronomical diaries. Night after night, century after century, regardless of who was king, regardless of whether the city was under siege or in a golden age, they recorded the positions of the stars. They noted the level of the river. They noted the price of barley. They noted the weather. They created a database of reality so vast and so detailed that it allows modern astronomers to calculate the rotation of the Earth in 500 BC with pinpoint accuracy. But why? Why this obsession? Why this desperate need to catalogue the dark? It suggests a civilization deeply traumatized by the unpredictability of nature. They were trying to find the rhythm within the chaos. They believed that if they could track the cycles of the gods, they could anticipate the blows. They were building a fortress of numbers against the unknown. And the numbers they built are the numbers we still live inside. Look at your wrist. Look at the clock. Why is an hour divided into 60 minutes? Why is a minute 60 seconds? Why is a circle 360 degrees? This is the heartbeat of Babylon. They used a sexagesimal system, base 60, because it is a number that can be easily divided by 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. It is a system of elegant divisibility. Every time you check the time, every time you navigate by GPS, you are using the mathematics of a priest standing on a mud brick tower 2,500 years ago. We're all, in a sense, still ticking to Babylonian time. But their greatest achievement and their greatest secret was the mastery of the Saros cycle. They discovered that eclipses, those terrifying moments when the sun or moon is devoured by darkness, were not random acts of divine anger. They were clockwork. They repeated every 18 years, 11 days, and 8 hours. To find this pattern requires consistent observation over many lifetimes. It requires a cultural memory that is stronger than death. Imagine the power of this knowledge. In the ancient world, an eclipse was a cosmic crisis. It was the death of the king. If the sun was darkened, the king had to die to satisfy the anger of the gods. But the Chaldeans, with their tablets and their math, could see the danger coming years in advance. They developed the ritual of the substitute king. When an eclipse was predicted, the real king would step down. He would hide in the palace stripped of his crown. A commoner, a gardener, a prisoner, a nobody would be dressed in the royal robes, seated on the throne and feasted. He would play the role of the king during the eclipse, and when the light returned, the substitute was executed, the cosmic debt was paid, the real king returned, untouched. Science was used to cheat fate. There is a recent discovery that deepens this mystery. We used to believe that the use of geometry to calculate the motion of planets, using the area under a curve to determine distance over time, was an invention of 14th century Europe. Calculus. But a few small, unassuming tablets from Babylon, analysing the motion of Jupiter, the star of Marduk, show that they were doing this nearly 2,000 years earlier. They were using abstract trapezoidal geometry to track the gods. They were doing calculus in clay. This implies a level of intellectual sophistication that makes us question the narrative of progress. We often view the ancients as superstitious primitives, but here were men who used advanced mathematics to map a four-dimensional reality. They saw time as a physical dimension that could be measured and shaped. However, there is a haunting question that lingers in the silence of the observatory. Were they just mapping the future, or were they watching for the return of a past catastrophe? Some controversial theories suggest that the obsession with planetary motion, particularly the erratic paths of Venus and Mars, stemmed from a time when the solar system was not so stable, a time of celestial violence that was burned into the collective memory of the Near East. Were the seven sages of their mythology, the Apkallu, actually astronomers from a pre-Diluvian age who passed down the coordinates of safety? The precision of their fear suggests they knew something we have forgotten. They watched the sky because they didn't trust it. They knew that the order of the world was fragile, held together by the will of Marduk and the math of the scribes. But as the Neo-Babylonian Empire reached its zenith, a rift began to open. The power of these priests was immense. They controlled the calendar, and therefore they controlled the economy, the festivals, and the legitimacy of the king. They were the gatekeepers of the divine. But what happens when a king stops looking at Marduk? What happens when a king turns his eyes to a different light in the sky? The final great king of Babylon, a man named Nabonidus, was not a warrior like Nebuchadnezzar. He was a scholar, he was a dreamer, and he was not interested in the status quo. He began to look past the great golden statue of Marduk, past the political machinery of the capital, and fixed his gaze on the moon, the cold, white, silent watcher that governs the tides and the madness of men. We are about to enter the strangest chapter of the story, the moment when the king becomes an archaeologist, digging into the ground to find a truth that the priests wanted to keep buried, the moment when the center cannot hold. The moon is rising, and with it, a new kind of silence. We have spent a long time looking up at the stars, tracking the mathematical clockwork of the heavens, but now the gaze of the empire shifts downward. It turns from the sky to the soil. We arrive at the reign of Nabonidus, the last king of the Neo-Babylonian dynasty, and perhaps the most enigmatic figure to ever sit on the throne of the four quarters of the world. History often gives us kings who are warriors, builders, or tyrants. Rarely does it give us a king who is a scholar, a man who seemed less interested in ruling the living than in conversing with the dead. Nabonidus is widely considered the world's first archaeologist. This is not a modern title retroactively applied. It was his obsession. While the Assyrian kings boasted of how many heads they piled at the city gates, Nabonidus boasted of how deep he dug. In his inscriptions, he speaks with the breathless excitement of a treasure hunter. He tells us that he excavated the foundations of the temples of Sippar and Lhasa, digging down 18 cubits into the earth, searching for the original cornerstones laid by kings from the dawn of time. Why? What compels the most powerful man on earth to spend his days sifting through the dirt? It suggests a profound crisis of legitimacy. Nabonidus was not of the royal bloodline. He came to the throne through a coup, a murder in the palace corridors. Perhaps he felt that the present was unstable, that the only way to secure his rule was to anchor it to the original truth, the deep time of the Sumerian ancestors. He wanted to touch the beginning. There is a famous cylinder where he claims to have found the foundation stone of Naram-Sin, the grandson of Sargon the Great. He writes, "I found the foundation which no king before me had seen for 3,200 years. Modern dating tells us he was off by about a millennium and a half. He overestimated the age of the past, but the sentiment is what matters. He was looking at a stone that had been buried before the rise of his own civilization, and he felt a kinship with it. He was trying to bypass the corrupted now to reach the pure then. He didn't just dig, he curated. In the city of he and his daughter, the Princess Enigaldi Nana, established what is likely the first museum in human history. They collected antiquities, statues of old kings, boundary stones, tablets, and they arranged them in a room for display. They even labelled them. Think about the mind that does this. It is a modern mind. It is a mind that sees history not as a living continuity, but as a series of broken epochs that must be categorized and preserved. It implies a sense of loss. You only build a museum when you feel that the thing you are preserving is dying. But Nabonidus's antiquarianism had a dangerous edge. His research led him to a theological conclusion that would tear the empire apart. As he dug deeper into the past, he decided that the current order of Babylon, the absolute supremacy of Marduk, the national god, was a mistake. He began to turn his face toward a different light. He turned to Sin, the moon god. The moon is different from the sun. The sun is the god of the day, of the city, of clear vision, of the king's law. The moon is the god of the night, of the nomad, of the changing tides, of madness and magic. Marduk was the god of Babylon, but Sin was older. Sin was the father of the sun. By elevating the moon, Nabonidus was reaching back to a primordial substrate of Mesopotamian religion, one that predated the political dominance of Babylon. This was not just a preference, it was a revolution. He rebuilt the great ziggurat of the moon at He installed his daughter as the high priestess there, reviving a title that had been defunct for centuries. He wrote prayers that describe the moon god as the Lord of Wisdom, the one who illuminates the darkness. And in the capital, the priests of Marduk watched with growing horror. To them this was heresy. The king was neglecting the New Year's festival. He was leaving the hand of Marduk ungrasped. The city's spiritual protection was being stripped away. We must consider the influence of his mother in this strange pivot. Adad-Gupi was a high priestess of the moon god in the northern city of Haran. She lived to be 104 years old, a lifespan that in itself seemed miraculous, a sign of divine favour. She left behind a stele, an autobiography written in stone, where she describes her devotion to the moon, how she prayed to him when the temples were destroyed, and how he promised to make her son king. Nabonidus was fulfilling a maternal prophecy. He was a son trying to honour the god of his mother's people, the god of the north, the god of the roots. But there is a sense of melancholy in his reign. The inscriptions describe him as a man set apart, a man who stands aside. He did not seem to enjoy the pageantry of the court. While the priest demanded rituals and feasts, Nabonidus was reading broken tablets, trying to decipher the geometry of lost temples. He was looking for a pattern that would explain the encroaching darkness. He saw the rise of the Persians in the east. He saw the instability of the world. And perhaps he believed that Marduk, the god of the status quo, was no longer strong enough to hold back the tide. He needed the older magic. He needed the moon. The tension in the city became unbearable. The king and the priesthood were at war, a silent war of omission, and passive aggression. The festivals were cancelled. The economy stuttered. The people whispered that the king was mad. And then Nabonidus did something that no king of Babylon had ever done, something that remains a mystery to this day. He didn't fight. He didn't purge the priests. He didn't assert his dominance. He simply packed his bags. He took his army, his scholars, and his closest advisors, and he walked away. He left the greatest city on earth, the center of civilization, the jewel of the empire. He marched south, deep into the Arabian desert, into the burning silence of the dunes. He was heading for an oasis called Tamar. Why? Was it a strategic move to control the spice trade routes? Was it a self-imposed exile to escape the toxic politics of the capital? Or was it a spiritual pilgrimage, a quest to find a pure place where he could worship the moon in peace, far from the jealous eyes of Marduk? He left his son, Belshazzar, behind to manage the city, a regent who had become famous for a different kind of failure. But the king disappeared into the sand. For 10 years, the throne of Babylon was empty. The New Year's festival could not be held. The gods remained trapped in their temples. The connection between heaven and earth was severed. The silence of the desert swallowed him. And back in Babylon, the people began to feel a creeping dread. A kingdom without a king is a body without a head. It is vulnerable. It is waiting for something to break. The first archaeologist had gone looking for the past, but he had left the present unguarded. What did he find out there, in the quartz and the heat of Tamar? What kind of silence was he seeking? The wind blows from the south, carrying sand, covering the tracks. We must follow him into the wilderness. We must try to understand the silence of Tamar. To understand the end of the empire, we must leave the fertile mud of the river valley and walk into the furnace. We must follow the king's footprints into a landscape that denies life. Nabonidus, the ruler of the civilized world, travelled nearly 1,000 kilometers south, crossing the red, shifting sands of the Nafud Desert, to reach an island of stone and palm trees called Tamar. It is a place that feels less like a city and more like a hallucination. Here, the air is so dry it cracks the skin. The silence is not the absence of noise, it is a physical pressure, a vacuum that sucks the thoughts right out of your head. For 10 years the king stayed here. 10 years. A decade is an eternity in politics. It is long enough for a generation to grow up without ever seeing the face of their sovereign. It is long enough for the memory of authority to fade into a ghost story. Why did he stay? This is the silence of Tamar, the great gap in the narrative that historians have tried to fill with theories of madness, strategy, or piety. But perhaps the truth is simpler and more terrifying. Perhaps he preferred the silence. Tamar was a hub of the incense trade, a crucial valve on the artery that brought frankincense and myrrh from the south. By seizing it, Nabonidus was choking the wealth of the Arab tribes and redirecting it to Babylon, a smart geopolitical move. But you do not need to live in a toll booth for 10 years to collect the toll. You send a general, you send a governor, you do not send the king. Archaeology gives us fragments of his life there. We have found steles in the desert, carved with the image of Nabonidus holding a scepter, standing before the symbols of the moon, the sun, and Venus. But there is a strangeness to the art. It is rougher, rawer than the polished reliefs of Babylon. He built a palace there, a little Babylon in the wastes. He surrounded himself with walls, planted gardens, and tried to recreate the center of the world in the middle of nowhere. It suggests a man who wanted to build a utopia, a pure religious state uncorrupted by the ancient entrenched priesthoods of the north. In the desert, the moon is not just a celestial body. It is the only lantern. It is the saviour, that cools the burning sand. To worship the moon in Babylon, amidst the smog and the torches and the ziggurats, was one thing. To worship the moon in Tamar, under a sky of crystalline clarity, was another. It was an encounter with the absolute. Nabonidus may have been seeking a direct channel to the divine, bypassing the bureaucracy of Marduk. He was trying to reset the spiritual frequency of the empire. But while the king was gazing at the moon in the silence of the dunes, Babylon was festering. A city without a king is a dangerous thing. It is like a solar system without a sun. The planets begin to drift, to collide. The crown prince, Belshazzar, was left in charge. We know him from the Bible as the man of the feast, the man of excess. But the historical records suggest a capable administrator who was paralyzed by his father's absence. He could manage the army, he could collect the taxes, but he could not perform the rites. The most critical festival of the Babylonian calendar was the Akitu, the New Year. It was the moment when the cosmos was renewed, when chaos was defeated for another 12 months. But the Akitu required the presence of the king. Only the king could take the hands of Bel-Marduk. Only the king could lead the god out of the temple. For 10 years the chronicle repeats the same dreary sentence. The king did not come to Babylon, the god Bel did not go out. Imagine the psychological impact of this. Year after year, the spiritual battery of the city was not recharged. The people watched the seasons turn with a growing sense of dread. They felt the protection of the gods thinning, wearing out like an old garment. The priests of Marduk, stripped of their most important ritual, began to whisper. They whispered that the king was not just absent, he was mad. They whispered that he was accursed. They wrote poems, political attack ads in the form of verse, mocking Nabonidus, calling him a mixer of strange rites, a man who confused the face of the moon with the face of a demon. The silence of Tamar became a vacuum that pulled in conspiracy. The verse account of Nabonidus, a text likely written by these angry priests, claims that the king had lost his mind, that he believed he was wise but spoke gibberish. It paints a portrait of a senile heretic holding court in the wilderness. Whether this was true or merely propaganda, it worked. The heart of the empire turned against its head. There is a theory that Nabonidus was suffering from a disease, perhaps a skin condition or a mental breakdown, and Tamar was a quarantine. The Levitical laws speak of leprosy requiring isolation. Did the king rot in the desert while his empire rotted from within? Or was the rot merely the inevitable decay of a system that had lasted too long? After 10 years, the silence broke. Nabonidus returned. We do not know why he chose that moment. Maybe he felt the cold wind blowing from the east. Maybe he heard the rumours of a new power rising in Persia, a man named Cyrus, who was conquering kingdoms with a terrifying speed. Nabonidus rode back into Babylon, but he did not return as a saviour. He returned as a stranger. He tried to fix it. He rushed to the temples. He ordered the statues of all the gods from the surrounding cities to be brought into Babylon for protection. It was a desperate act of spiritual hoarding. He was gathering the divine pantheon behind the walls, trying to create a shield of gods against the coming storm. But the people did not see it as protection. They saw it as theft. They saw a desperate old man stealing their local gods to save his own skin. The city he returned to was not the city he had left. The mood had shifted from anxiety to resignation. The writing on the wall was not yet visible, but the invisible ink was already there. The gates were strong, the walls were thick, the granaries were full, but the will to fight had evaporated. The 10 years of silence had done their work. The people had learned to live without him. And in learning to live without him, they had learned that perhaps they didn't need a Babylonian king at all. Nabonidus stood on the balcony of his palace, looking out at the city he had neglected, the city he had tried to bypass. He must have felt the isolation. He had left the silence of the desert only to find a different, colder silence in the crowded streets. The silence of betrayal. The moon was setting. The sun of Persia was rising. And the river Euphrates, the ancient protector of the city, was about to become its greatest weakness. The stage is set for the final act. The feast is prepared. The guest list includes ghosts. The end of the world does not always arrive with a bang. Sometimes it arrives with a drop in water pressure. We stand now at the precipice of the year 539 BC. The summer heat is fading, and the harvest has been gathered. Babylon is a sealed vessel, a self-contained universe behind walls that were deemed impenetrable. The historian Herodotus tells us that the Babylonians had stocked enough food to last for years. They looked out from their high towers at the gathering Persian army and they laughed. They laughed because they believed in the geometry of their safety. They believed in the physics of the moat. But they forgot that physics is neutral and geometry can be rewritten by a mind that looks at the problem from a different angle. Outside the walls there is a new silence. The Persian army, led by Cyrus the Great, has stopped moving. They are not building siege engines. They are not battering the gates. They are digging. To the north of the city, out of sight of the sentries, thousands of men are working with shovels, cutting a canal into the soft earth. They are not trying to bridge the moat. They are trying to drain it. They are preparing to perform a miracle of engineering, to steal the river Euphrates, the god that had protected Babylon for 2,000 years, and turn it aside. Inside the palace, the mood is frantic, manic, a hysteria masquerading as a celebration. We enter the great hall. The air is thick with the smoke of expensive incense and the smell of roasted meats. This is the Feast of Belshazzar. It is a scene that has been painted by Rembrandt and narrated by poets. A tableau of supreme arrogance. Belshazzar, the regent, the son of the absent-minded archaeologist king, is throwing a party while the enemy sits on his doorstep. Why? Perhaps it was a show of strength, a morale-boosting performance to prove that life goes on. Or perhaps it was the nihilism of a man who knows the end is coming and decides to drink the cellar dry. But this was not just a feast, it was a blasphemy. In a drunken command, Belshazzar orders the servants to bring out the gold and silver vessels, the cups, the bowls, the basins, that his father Nebuchadnezzar had looted from the temple in Jerusalem decades earlier. These were the sanctified tools of a foreign god, objects charged with the trauma of a displaced people. To use them for a drinking party was to mock the sacred. As the wine poured into the golden goblets, the king praised the gods of gold and of silver, of brass, of iron, of wood, and of stone. He was asserting the dominance of matter over spirit. And then the rupture. The atmosphere in the hall shifts. The noise dies down, not gradually, but instantly. A chill moves through the room that has nothing to do with the night air. Opposite the lampstand, on the plaster of the wall of the king's palace, the fingers of a human hand appear. Just the fingers. No arm, no body. Just a disembodied instrument of writing scratching against the lime. Imagine the sound. The scratch of a fingernail on stone, amplified by the sudden, terrified silence of 1,000 guests. The king's face turns pale. His thoughts trouble him. The joints of his loins are loosed, and his knees knock against each other. This is the physiological reaction to an encounter with the impossible. It is the intrusion of a higher reality into the closed system of the feast. The writing is encoded. Mene, Mene, Tekel, Upharsin. The wise men of Babylon, the Chaldeans, the very men who had mapped the stars and invented calculus, stand before the wall and are mute. They cannot read it. It is a script that defies their data. It requires a different kind of interpreter, And so, the old exile is brought in. Daniel, the man who has outlived kings, the man who remembers the God of the vessels, he reads the riddle. It is not a poem, it is an accounting ledger. Mene, God has numbered your kingdom and finished it. Tekel, you have been weighed in the balances and found wanting. Peres, your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and Persians. It is a message of economic and moral bankruptcy. The empire has spent its spiritual capital. The balance sheet is zero. The time is up. While the interpretation is being delivered in the hushed terror of the throne room, the physics outside are completing the prophecy. The level of the Euphrates is dropping. The water is receding from the reed beds, exposing the wet, slick mud of the river bottom. The great natural barrier, the liquid wall, is becoming a highway. Herodotus describes the scene with a cinematic clarity. The Persian soldiers, waiting in the darkness, watched the water level sink until it reached the height of a man's thigh. And then they walked in. They walked under the great iron gates along the riverbank which, in a detail that suggests either divine intervention or massive treason, had been left unlocked. The Babylonians were so drunk, so secure, so distracted by the feast, that they left the back door open. The fall of Babylon was not a battle, it was a filtration. The Persians flowed into the city like the water they had displaced. There were no burning buildings, no crumbling walls, no heroic last stands in the streets. The Cyrus cylinder, the Persian propaganda text written after the victory, claims that Cyrus entered Babylon without a battle and without fighting. He claims that the god Marduk, angry with Nabonidus and his heretical moon worship, literally took Cyrus by the hand and led him into the city as a liberator. But the reality on the ground was likely a swift surgical violence. Xenophon, the Greek historian, tells us that the Persian vanguard reached the palace while the feast was still in progress. They found the doors closed, but the guards, hearing the commotion, opened them to see what was happening. The Persians rushed in. The king was found standing, sword in hand, but it was too late. The golden head of the statue was severed. The shock of this event cannot be overstated. Babylon was the eternal city. It was the Rome, the New York, the London of its day. The idea that it could fall in a single night, without a siege, was inconceivable. It sent a shockwave through the ancient world. The prophets of Israel saw it as the vengeance of Yahweh. The priest of Marduk saw it as the vengeance of Bel. Everyone claimed the victory for their own god. But beneath the theology, there is a profound lesson about the fragility of power. Babylon fell because it stopped paying attention. It fell because it believed its own propaganda. It fell because it was busy toasting its own invincibility in the stolen cups of a conquered people, while the water beneath its feet was quietly being drained away. Cyrus the Great rode into the city the next morning. He did not come to destroy, he came to inherit. He walked on green branches spread before him. He commanded that the temples be protected, that the daily offerings continue. He presented himself not as a foreign invader, but as the legitimate successor, the man who would restore order. He was the king of the four corners of the world. And just like that, the Neo-Babylonian Empire, the empire of the Blue Gates and the Hanging Gardens and the Tower of Babel, was extinguished. It didn't explode, it just changed management. The scribes kept writing, the stars kept turning, the sun rose over the ziggurat just as it had the day before, but the spirit of the place had shifted. The independent native rule of Mesopotamia was over, essentially forever. The age of the empires had begun. But as the Persian flags were unfurled over the Esagila, and the bodies of the feast were quietly removed from the palace, a strange dust began to settle over the city. A dust that would eventually cover everything. For even though Cyrus spared the buildings, the soul of Babylon had received a mortal wound. We are now moving towards the long, slow fade, the afterlife of a city, the time when the stone returns to sand. The party is over. The wine has dried in the cups and the writing on the wall has faded into the plaster. We tend to think of the fall of Babylon as a sudden blackout, a curtain dropping on the stage, but civilizations do not die like that. They do not vanish in an instant. They fade, they ghost, they linger like a scent in a room long after the occupant has left. The Persian conquest was not the end of the city. It was the beginning of its long, slow transformation into a memory. For 2 centuries under the Persian kings, Babylon remained a jewel. It was the winter capital, a place of soft breezes and ancient prestige. The great kings, Darius, Artaxerxes, sat on the throne of Nebuchadnezzar. They walked the processional way. They respected the gods. But the spark was gone. The city was no longer the engine of the world. It was a trophy case. It was a museum where the Persians kept the past on display. There were moments of violence, of course. When the city rebelled against Xerxes, the king of kings showed none of Cyrus's mercy. He is said to have melted down the massive golden statue of Bel-Marduk, the 18-foot giant that anchored the city's soul. Imagine the psychological horror of that moment. To see your god, the protector of the universe, dragged out of the temple, cut into pieces, and fed into a furnace to become coins for soldiers. It was the ultimate secularization. The divine was turned into currency. The axis of the world was broken, not by nature, but by the economy of empire. And then a final flash of lightning. In 331 BC, Alexander the Great marched in. The young Macedonian, with his hair like a lion's mane and his eyes fixed on the horizon, fell in love with the old city. He didn't want to destroy it. He wanted to wear it. He planned to make Babylon the capital of his universal empire, the centre of a domain that stretched from Greece to India. He saw the ruins of the Etemenanki, the great tower that had been crumbling for centuries, and he ordered it to be rebuilt. He put 10,000 men to work clearing the debris. For a brief, shining moment, it seemed as if the cycle was going to reverse. The tower would rise again. The silence would be broken. But history has a cruel sense of irony. It was here, in the palace of Nebuchadnezzar, in the hanging gardens that may or may not have existed, that Alexander died. He was 32 years old. He had conquered the known world, only to be defeated by a mosquito, or a cup of poisoned wine, or the sheer exhaustion of being a god among men. He died in the heart of the city he tried to resurrect, and with his last breath, the hope of Babylon died too. The generals fought over his corpse. The plans for the tower were abandoned. The bricks were left in piles, waiting for masons who would never come. After Alexander, the decline accelerated. The new Greek rulers, the Seleucids, did something more devastating than burning the city. They ignored it. They built a new capital Seleucia on the Tigris. They invited the merchants, the scholars, and the artists to move, and they did. Slowly, the lifeblood of Babylon was siphoned off. The markets emptied, the canals silted up. The great houses were abandoned to the wind and the scorpions. This is the most melancholy phase of all. The phase of the ghost city. Imagine walking through Babylon in the year 150 BC. The walls are still standing, but they defend nothing. The temples are still there, but the roofs have caved in. You can hear your own footsteps echoing in the squares where millions once gathered. There are still a few priests left, old men tending to the fading fires of Marduk, copying the ancient texts in a script that fewer and fewer people can read. They are the caretakers of a dying memory, performing rituals for a god who has stopped answering. The death of a language is a quiet thing. It doesn't happen with a scream. It happens when the last person who knows the words closes their eyes. The cuneiform script, the wedge-shaped writing that had been invented in Sumer 3,000 years earlier, the script that had recorded the first laws, the first epics, the first observations of Venus, held on in Babylon longer than anywhere else. We have found the very last datable cuneiform tablet. It is an astronomical almanac. It is dated to 75 AD. Think about that date. The Roman Empire is at its height. Jesus of Nazareth has already lived and died. The Colosseum is being built in Rome, and in the crumbling ruins of Babylon, one solitary astronomer is still pressing a reed into wet clay, tracking the movements of the planets, preserving the Chaldean wisdom one last time. When he finished that tablet, when he set it in the sun to dry, a 3,000-year tradition ended. The signal went dead. The silence was finally absolute. From that point on, the city became a quarry. The neighbouring villagers looked at the massive walls not as a wonder of the world, but as a source of free building material. They took the bricks, they took the baked squares stamped with Nebuchadnezzar's name and used them to build their ovens, their stables, their huts. The city was cannibalized. Babylon was dismantled brick by brick and absorbed into the landscape. The great palaces dissolved back into the mud from which they came. By the Middle Ages, travellers could no longer find it. They would ride past the mounds of earth near the Euphrates and not even know that the golden head of prophecy lay beneath their feet. The name Babylon survived, but only as a metaphor. It lived on in the Bible and the Apocalypse as the symbol of the great harlot, the city of sin, the enemy of God. The physical reality of the astronomers, the architects, and the poets was erased, replaced by a theological caricature. So what is left? If you go there today, you will see mounds of brown earth. You'll see the reconstructed walls built by Saddam Hussein, a dictator who, like Nabonidus, tried to link his regime to the ancient kings and failed. You will see the Lion of Babylon, a basalt statue that was never finished, standing over a man who is being crushed. It is a fitting symbol. The stone survives. The man does not. We have walked a long road, from the ashes of Nineveh to the dust of the modern desert. We have seen the rise of the walls, the arrogance of the tower, the weeping of the exiles, and the silence of the moon. What is the lesson of the Neo-Babylonian Empire? Perhaps it is simply this, that we're all building in mud. We build our skyscrapers, our networks, our ideologies, and we bake them in the fire of our ambition, thinking they will last forever. We stamp our names on the bricks, but the river shifts, the climate changes, the language evolves, and eventually the wind comes to reclaim the clay. Babylon is not just a place in Iraq, it is a state of being. It is the human condition. We are all living in a city that is slowly turning back into sand. The night is deep now. The stars, the same stars the Chaldeans watched, are wheeling overhead, indifferent to our names and our dates. The signal is fading. The history is written. The tablet is dry. Sleep well.